먼저 블룸버그 선정 세계 1위 미래학자인 제인슨 생커 퓨처리스트 인스티튜트 회장께서 주제 발표를 해 주시겠습니다. 네, 포스트 코로나가 만든 세계질서 재편, 한국의 포지셔닝, 이런 주제를 갖고 발표를 해 주시겠는데요. 함께 영상으로 만나보시겠습니다.
Hello, I'm Jason Schenker, Chairman of the Futurist Institute. Today, I'm going to speak with you about disruption and transformation of the ICT industry after COVID. But before I do, I want to point out the pin on my lapel. The colorful hexagonal emblem symbolizes the fusion characteristics of ICT with various faces. The fragment of the stone that forms it is a pictogram that embodies the letters ICT. Now, as we think about the future disruption and transformation of the ICT industry after COVID, we should really start by thinking about and recognizing the key technologies that saved the day in the face of pandemic. And these were technologies that were already ascending. And of course, I'm talking about remote work, online education, and e-commerce. These weren't new technologies. In fact, they've been ascending for years and in some cases, decades. But it was that flashpoint of COVID-19 that really pushed people and companies to adopt and accept the technologies that were already available. It was a digital transformation of choice of sorts because there always was an opportunity to embrace these technologies, at least for many, many years. But only now, when companies had to, did they choose to embrace the technologies and move forward. There are significant implications of these adoptions for the future of the ICT industry. As we look at the forecasts, and I've shared here our global forecast from the Futurist Institute and what we expect for traditional technologies in ICT through 2025, as well as for new technologies through 2025. In the year 2020, we see traditional technologies likely to be between 4 and 4.5 trillion US dollars, and new technologies pretty close to $1 trillion. By 2025, though, those new technologies are likely to have risen from around 1 trillion to between 2.5 and $3 trillion. While we see traditional technologies rising from between 4 and 4.5 trillion to just short of $6 trillion. These are significant increases where we see almost a 50% increase in the growth in traditional technologies. And for the new technologies, we see a 150% increase in the 5 years ahead. So what do we mean by these different categories? Let's dig a little bit into this, and then we'll come back to how those technologies that saved us will play such a critical role in the years ahead. As we look at the breakdown on a global basis, and this is 2019 data, of the different ICT industries, we see from a traditional basis, telecom, the biggest percentage, then hardware and services, followed by new technologies and software. That's the global breakdown. Those new technologies, which represent only about 16% in 2019 for the ICT industry, are the ones that are likely to grow the most in the years ahead. As we look at what defines these new technologies, the lion's share, the biggest percentage of those, is in IoT, the Internet of Things. Most people that are thinking about the internet today, they live the way we do with the internet connected and enabled devices that are phones, tablets, computers, and the like. But the increased use of sensors and more connectivity for devices is where already the new technologies in ICT have already been most prevalent. And this is in the most recent years. Going forward, it is IoT that continues to present some of the biggest upside opportunities for ICT. And of course, as we think about IoT and sensors and data and measuring everything and putting sensors on everything we can, there will be increased needs also for traditional technologies in ICT. After all, as the new technologies grow, there's also likely to be additional needs for hardware, software, and the like. Now let's consider those three big areas that were so critical during the COVID-19 pandemic for the economy and in some respects for society to continue to function, especially at the time of the initial outbreak of the pandemic. Remote work is probably the best place to start. And if we think about how important remote work is, this isn't really something that's just a new phenomenon. In fact, a survey from 2016, so 4 years ago, in the Financial Times, showed that the most critical technologies impacting millennials for the future of work, and this was asked at the time of people who were between the ages of 16 and 25. Those people today are between the ages of 20 and 29. But they asked millennials, what do you think the future things will be that most impact how you work? And they could pick three. The top item was mobile, internet, and cloud technology. That is where remote work and online education and e-commerce have been, are, and again, this is data years ago, looking to the present. It's important sometimes to take that as a retrospective thought of, in the past, the expectation already was for millennials that mobile internet cloud would be the number one most critical technology impacting the future of work. And now, here we are, and that's true. But if we look at the next three categories down, these include artificial intelligence and machine learning, the rise of big data, and the Internet of Things. Those three areas are tied heavily to data collection, data aggregation, data analysis, and forecasting. And especially IoT is explicitly tied to new areas of development in ICT. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But I wanted to highlight that this expectation that mobile internet cloud would be so important for the future of work was something people saw years ago. Even I myself have been working remotely since 2007. Prior to that, I'd worked in a bank. And even though I was the chief energy and commodity economist at the third biggest bank in the United States, I was told I couldn't have a laptop because I wasn't senior enough and laptops were too valuable and too scarce. This was in 2007, or well, 2004 to 2007. But in 2007, I left banking and I joined McKinsey. And on the first day, they handed all of us a laptop and said, "This is your office." What a difference, day and night, that in the same year I worked for a bank and wasn't senior enough to have a laptop. The day you go to a consulting firm, everyone gets one. And because no one has offices, all you have is your laptop. But again, like the survey data you see here, this isn't new. This is what happened in 2007. And in 2009, when I started my own company, Prestige Economics, and later the Futurist Institute in 2016, I never had an office and I only have ever worked remotely. Why? Well, if it was good enough for McKinsey, it seemed good enough for my own firm as well. Now, the trend towards remote work has been growing in many ways. If we look at, for example, changes in commuter modes between 2005 and 2015, this shows the changes in how people went to work. And although there were some significant increases in people taking public transportation, that went up 25%, or people walking, and that was up 34%. It was telecommuting that had risen by 115%. Again, this wasn't something that only happened just before the pandemic. This had been going on for a long time before that. Additionally, one of the biggest things that impacts whether people could work remotely, based on recent United States data from 2018, is how much education you have. If you have an advanced degree, you are more likely to work at home. Just under that, though, are people who have bachelor's degrees. But if you have an advanced degree, it was quite likely. Additionally, if we look at data going back from 2013 to 2017, the occupations that were most likely to be remote out of all occupations was, and you can see it here in the middle bar, there's the yellow, which is other, green, which is workplace and home, the dark blue, which is workplace only, and the light blue here, that's people who only worked at home. And although that was kind of a smaller percentage of all employees, it's a much bigger percentage of this category in the middle. And this category represents management, professional, and related occupations. Again, these are jobs that require people to have usually advanced degrees and high levels of skill. The more skill, the more education you have, the more likely, before COVID, you were already working remotely. This is really important because if we think about who are consumers of ICT, it's probably people with advanced degrees. And of course, if we see more people eventually go to take advanced degrees, something I'll talk about in just a second, there's going to be additional demand and needs to serve remote workers. The last thing I want to say about this trend of remote work is that even the most recent data for remote work for September of 2020 out of the United States shows in yellow here the percent of people over age 25 with advanced degrees who are working remotely or worked from home at any time in September 2020 because of the pandemic was 49.5%. Almost half of all people with advanced degrees worked at home in September of 2020. This is really important because this number is down from where it was in May. In May, it was almost 70%. But this percentage does not include the percent of people with advanced degrees already working remotely, like we just saw in the other graphs. These are only the people working remotely because of the pandemic. In other words, while 49.5% of people in the United States over age 25 with advanced degrees were working remotely in September 2020 because of the pandemic, the total number of people with advanced degrees who worked remotely in September 2020 was probably closer to 2/3 or 3/4 of the population with advanced degrees. For people with bachelor's degrees who worked remotely at any time in September 2020, it was 36.6% in September. But if we include from those previous graphs that people with bachelor's degrees also worked remotely more than people in other work categories, the actual percentage in September was probably closer to 50%. This is really important because in the future, if you want to hire people with high levels of education and high levels of skill, it means you might have to be prepared to hire people who work remotely. It also means that there is a huge difference between how people have experienced the pandemic and how people experience work in general. After all, the chart also shows that people with less than a high school diploma, only 3.6% of those workers worked remotely. In other words, if you don't have a lot of education, it's probably difficult for you to work remotely. But if you have a lot of education It's easy for you to work remotely, and you might actually expect to work remotely in the future. One of the things I've been talking about most recently with the customers and clients I have is that as they think about moving into the post-pandemic period and they want to grow their business, they might need to be prepared to hire people that work remote. Because the longer you have people working remote, especially people with higher levels of education, there aren't as many of those people, and they might become accustomed to that remote work. And so, if you want to hire them, you might have to be prepared to offer them jobs that keep them in that lifestyle. Now, as for the education piece, this is another area that's going to drive ICT, and it's another thing that helps save the day in terms of society for COVID-19. But online education, in the same way with remote work, is not a new trend. If we look at this graph, for example, in the growth of massive open online courses, we know that this has already been going on for a decade plus. Coursera, Udemy, LinkedIn Learning, there are many different companies that have very large online platforms. Even the Futurist Institute offers online courses. This is very common for many kinds of entities, all the way up to universities, to offer online education. I did all the courses for a designation as a certified financial planner, something that's recognized in the US by financial regulatory authorities. I did all those courses online back in 2009. And I did an entire master's degree online between 2014 and 2016. My wife is doing an MBA online right now. And in the future, even more people will be doing online education. The reason for this is simple. There is value in education. And one of the most important sets of data available out of the US, and I use a lot of US data, not just because I live in the United States, but because there's a lot of data collection around these kinds of questions. And one of the things we see is, in this graph, two parts. On the left, you see the unemployment rates by education. And what you see is the unemployment rates are the highest at the bottom of the table. That's where people have less than a high school diploma. But the unemployment rate is the lowest at the top, where people have doctoral degrees. And what's really interesting is that every time you move up a level of formal education, your odds of being unemployed actually go down. On the right-hand side of the graph, you see income. And this is also correlated with education, but unlike unemployment, that is inversely correlated with education, income is positively correlated with education. And you can see that the lowest earnings weekly in the United States are for people with less than a high school diploma. And every time more formal education happens, the money goes up until you hit doctoral degree, and that's the highest level. If you have less than a high school diploma, well, that's not a lot. But if you get a bachelor's degree, you'll earn more than double what someone without high school diploma earns. And if you have a doctoral degree, you earn more than triple what someone without a high school diploma earns. And again, this data is for national data across the United States for 2019. And this isn't an exception. If I were to show you a graph of unemployment rates over time by education, you would see that the unemployment rates that are the lowest are consistently for people with higher education. And even in a recession, the unemployment rate goes up less for people with more education than it does for people with very little education. People with more education, it goes up less. That's important. There's also one other thing. This is going to drive the online education piece, not just because many schools or universities or students were forced to accept and take a leap into online education, but also because these numbers make sense. There is ROI to being more educated. You are, as we just saw, not only less likely to be unemployed with more education, you're likely to earn more money, And you're also more likely to be working remotely. But there's a fourth piece. And the fourth piece is based on some data that was put together in the year 2016 by the Office of the US President, then President Obama, in 2016. And this is the share of jobs with highly automatable skills, broken down by education level. What you'll notice is on the left is less education and on the right is more. If you have a job that doesn't require much education, it is probably highly automatable. It means your job is going to be gone. But as you move to the right, if your job requires more skill, more education, more training, you are much less likely to have a highly automatable job. So let's look for a second. We see less than a high school diploma. 44% of those jobs in 2016 were considered highly automatable. The minute we go down to a job that requires a trade school certificate, this is like being a plumber or an electrician, only 8% of those jobs are considered highly automatable. If we go a little bit further down the line to a bachelor's degree, only 1% of those jobs were considered highly automatable in 2016. And if your job requires a master's degree, well, then it's 0%. So those are the four big benefits of having more education. You are less likely to have your job automated, you're more likely to be employed, you're more likely to make more money, and you're more likely to work remote or be able to work remote at any rate. Now, the third big area of change that helped carry the day during the COVID-19 pandemic and economic shutdown was the supply chain. It was e-commerce, in-hand retail. This took a massive jump and leap forward. If we look at e-commerce and retailer percentage there, we see that went from around 12% and skyrocketed up towards 16% in just one quarter. And this is the percent of all retail sales in the United States that go to retailers that are predominantly in e-commerce. Many people were forced to shelter in place, to stay home, and they relied on e-commerce and the supply chain to help them get what they needed. This also presents additional demands for ICT as we look forward, because you're going to see also a lot of the newer technologies, robotics, automation. These will be employed to solve last mile issues, to make sure that people can receive their goods even to their very doorstep. And more of the supply chain will become automated. Looking forward in the immediate term, there are many reasons to be positive looking at 2021. One of those reasons is a survey of the material handling industry. This is actually a data index that I helped create. This series shows future new orders. And what it reflects is the percent of executives in leadership roles in the U.S. material handling industry who say they expect new orders will be better 12 months from now than they are at the moment. You'll notice in recent months, it's all the way at the top. It's at 100%. This indicates that executives in supply chain, in e-commerce, expect that a year from now, even though everything is booming right now, new orders will be even better 12 months in the future. Also, because physical goods have been so important in the global economy, we should also recognize that manufacturing has rebounded more quickly than other industries. This graphic is a combination of three of the world's most important purchasing manager indices, otherwise known as PMIs. It's the sum of the US ISM Manufacturing Index, the Chinese Caixin Manufacturing Index, and the Eurozone Manufacturing PMI. Together, these three economies, the US, China, and the Eurozone, represent about 60% of global GDP. What you see here is the black line in the middle at 150 is the break even. In any given month, if that red line is above 150, that means manufacturing in that 60% of the global economy is expanding. If it's below 150, that means manufacturing in that month was contracting. You can see on the left side of the graph where there's the Great Recession between 2007 and 2009. Global manufacturing fell very hard, and it took a little bit of time to come back. But on the right, you can see the recession around the COVID-19 pandemic and the initial outbreak and the shutdowns all associated with that. And you can see it dropped, but then it came back very quickly. And the drop was not as severe as on the left side of the graph during the Great Recession. Also, on the far right of the graph, it's way above 150 now, which is a positive leading indicator of manufacturing and growth. This series not only leads growth, but it leads GDP. And we expect that global manufacturing will remain strong in coming months for a few different reasons, one of which is the cost of money has gone down. Manufacturing, including ICT, tends to be extremely capital intensive, and the cost of money has fallen everywhere. In the United States, interest rates are between 0 and 0.25%, and they're likely to remain that cheap all the way into at least 2024. In Europe, they've had negative deposit rates from the central bank for many years now, going all the way back to 2014. It's been almost 6 years. And in Korea, the central bank interest rate is at 0.5%. Also, very cheap money. In most economies, this is true. And this is very good for manufacturing. And when the money's cheap and manufacturing is capital intensive, it grows. But manufacturing and capital intensive industries also tend to lead GDP growth, which means global growth is likely to rise. Now, this dynamic is important in countries like the United States and also in the Eurozone, but not as important as it is in China and Korea. In the United States and the Eurozone, GDP growth, manufacturing as a percent of GDP growth, is between 10 and 13%, depending how you measure it. But in China and Korea, it's between 20 and 25%. That's a much bigger percent of GDP that's tied to manufacturing. And if the year ahead, 2021, has cheap money and continued good manufacturing, this should be good for the US and good for the Eurozone, but it should be very good for Korea and very good for China. Those are just some of the dynamics we generally would expect going forward. But there's more. And if we look beyond 2021 for ICT, there are a number of important trends and dynamics we believe will be increasingly important. We see a mix of both risks and opportunities. Opportunities I've talked a little bit about. Remote life, that online education, e-commerce, remote work, all of that. Convenience, automation ROI, like we see in supply chain. Safety and contactless technologies, as well as data volumes and IoT, something we've talked about a couple times now. All of those are big opportunities, but there are also some risks. Regulation, governance, and the trade war. The US and China have been in a trade war for years, and on a global basis, this could continue to cause supply chain issues. But for Korea, it could represent an opportunity. After all, if the United States wants more computers manufactured outside of China, Korea is a very strong option. This is something that could actually be beneficial for the Korean ICT industry, even if it turns out to be disruptive for the global ICT industry or more negative for the Chinese ICT industry. But there are other dynamics at play too. One of the most important things going on as we think big picture is the fact that Moore's law is breaking down. ICT demands could increase simply because some of the legacy trends in improvements of capability and lower cost, that's Moore's law, that every year you can get more processing power at a lower price. What a deal, except that's been breaking down. That means that until we have a step change in computation, and maybe something like commercial grade quantum computing, people are going to need to buy more processors to process their data. They won't necessarily have better ones. They're just going to have to buy more. This is really important. It's a brute force solution, but it's one that could make it more expensive. And of course, if we believe IoT and data volumes are going up, well, there's going to be a lot more data to analyze and a lot more data to collect. If processors don't continue to get more powerful and more expensive at the same time, that means companies are going to have to continue to invest more and more and more money in processors. So this is one of the things that could feed the traditional ICT growth. Even if the new technologies grow faster, until we get that step change, there's likely to be continued strong demand growth, not just demand, but demand growth across traditional ICT as well. We also see that as people look to use data, there are opportunities and there are challenges. The easiest things that people can do with data are cut costs, but it's more difficult. I mean, gosh, cutting costs, that's something I did in consulting 12 years ago. It's not new. You collect lots and lots of data, you go through all the line items, and you start bucketing things and find opportunities. That's been around for a long time. But using data to move to more complicated things, for example, using data to find new innovations or transform a business or, establish a data-driven culture. Those are not easy tasks. That takes a lot of effort. That is where we're going to see, again, continued ICT needs to help bridge that gap between all the data and the value of all the data. This will be the big push of ICT in the decade ahead. Not necessarily cheaper storage, but the big decade ahead push, collecting more data, processing, analyzing, and finding value in more data. This is what the big decade ahead is about. As we look, I would again share that global ICT forecast where you can see that new technologies in a percentage change basis are expected to go up so much greater from 2020 to 2025, right? From around that 1 trillion to the 2.5 to 3 trillion level. That's a big jump. But even those traditional technologies going up as well, from 4 to 4.5 trillion, all the way up to between 5.5 and 6 trillion. Also big increases, but in percentage terms, those new technologies are critical. And as I've already alluded to a couple times here, it's really quantum computing that's going to be absolutely critical beyond this decade in order to help achieve step change opportunities and extract the greatest value from large data series where you want to be doing certain kinds of calculations. Now, I'm not saying that you need to be an expert on how quantum computers work, and I would tell you most people I know, if I said the word semiconductor, they'd probably think it was a person who drove a small train or conducted in front of half an orchestra. For those folks, they don't need to know about quantum computing and how it works. But what they will benefit from is that over time, quantum computing will be a way that we can extract value from data. It might be quantum as a service, where quantum computing is remote, like a lot of what we do in the cloud, and we access it and feed it data in order to get the answers that we're looking for in a non-deterministic, probabilistic fashion. But it will still take years before we get to that commercialization level. And until then, the new technologies in existence, as well as traditional ICT, will be critical. Now, as we look forward at global and Korean trends in ICT, there are a couple of things that are really important to be aware of. First is, if we look at the regional dynamics and ICT breakdown, Asia is extremely important. For hardware, absolutely, but also extremely important for telecom as well. These dynamics are likely to continue in so much as Asia is likely to remain absolutely critical for the ICT industry. And Korea is likely, if there's displacement because of trade wars, regulations, governance issues, Korea could actually pick up some of that Chinese business and may see their ICT business grow even more strongly. As we look at the emerging ICT activities and we think about where they are in Asia, recent data reflect that IoT and robotics are huge in Asia. This is clear, right? Robotics, there's a joke in the United States that here robots are a myth and everywhere else they're a reality. Or maybe it's robots here are an obsession and everywhere else they're a reality. But more so in Asia than almost anywhere else. As for IoT, that strong Asian activity in IoT, that's likely to continue to remain very, very strong. We're going to see that continue to present opportunities throughout Asia as well as in Korea. Overall, as we look at the Korean ICT market, and these are forecasts the Futurist Institute has produced through 2025, we see significant growth. These forecasts are in trillions of Korean won. And what we see is from 2020, around 500 trillion to between 650 and 700 trillion in 2025. That's a very big jump. Overall, this will continue to represent around 10% of global ICT. That's a big number considering the population of Korea. This is an outsized impact that Korea has had in ICT, and I expect will continue to have across ICT industries in 2021 and the decade ahead. Thank you.
자, 그럼 이제 발표해 주신 미국 오스틴에 있는 제이슨 쉔커 회장님을 모셔보도록 하겠습니다. Hello, it is my pleasure.
네, 안녕하십니까? 세 가지 질문을 드릴 텐데요. 우선 한국 시청자들께 인사를 부탁드리겠습니다. 네, 여러분 안녕하십니까? 여러분들과 이렇게 온라인으로 연결해서 말씀드리게 되어 기쁘고 영광입니다.
네, 사전에 질문 주신 것 중에 3개 중에서 3개를 선별해서 보내드릴 텐데요. 먼저 첫 번째 질문은 코로나19 이후로 한국 산업은 특히 IT와 반도체를 중심으로 더 좋아질지 아니면 더 나빠질지 궁금하고요. 또 디지털 트랜스포메이션을 위해서 어떻게 준비를 해야 될지 궁금합니다. 라고 이렇게 질문을 주셨습니다.
Well, I think, and I hope this came across in my remarks, that I'm
네,
very
제가
optimistic
발표에서도 언급을
about what the
드렸습니다만
prospects are for the
한국의
ICT
산업,
industry.
특히 IT 산업 전망에 대해서 대단히 낙관을 하고 있습니다. 코로나19 직후뿐만이 아니라 장기적으로 봤을 때도 상당히 긍정적입니다. 다양한 역학관계로 봤을 때 아주 좋은 전망을 가지고 있고, 그리고 경제적인 영향이나 사회적인 영향이 코로나19로 인해서 한국에서는 그렇게 크지 않았습니다. 실업률도 다른 국가에 비해서도 낮게 나오고 있고요. 그 이외에도 경제 지표들이 한국에서는 상당히 좋은 상황입니다. 다른 국가에 비해서요. 그래서 코로나 이후에도 한국이 아주 좋은 입지를 유지할 것으로 생각하고요. 그리고 ICT 산업이나 그리고 전체 한국 경제도 좋은 전망을 유지할 것으로 저는 확신합니다.
네, 두 번째 질문인데요. 네, 한국은 수출에 의존하는 경제 구조이고 또 기업은 글로벌 SCM 생태계에 맞춰 변화해 왔습니다. 하지만 코로나 이후의 경제는 자국 중심의 SCM 생태계로 변화될 가능성이 높다고 봅니다. 이런 점에서 한국의 기업 무엇을 준비해야 될까요?
Thank you very much for this question.
네, 이 질문 대단히 감사합니다. 정말 훌륭한 질문이기도 합니다. 가장 중요한 부분, 특히 한국 기업들에게 중요한 부분은 디지털 기술들을 더욱더 적극 수용해야 된다는 것입니다. 지금 초기 단계로 많이 수용이 되고 있지만 더욱더 강력하게 끌어안고 앞으로 진행을 한다면 더 긍정적인 효과를 발휘할 수 있을 겁니다. 그 이외에 긍정적인 많은 역학관계가 한국 내에서 진행되고 있는데요. 한국판 뉴딜이라든지 그린딜이나 이런 부분들이 대단히 긍정적인 동인이 될 것입니다. 이러한 기술들을 적극적으로 수용을 하고 또 앞으로의 전환을 함께 발맞춰 나간다면, 역행하지 않는다면 전 세계 수준의 세계질 수준의 ICT 제품들을 내놓고 또 앞으로 계속해서 IT 산업 발전을 도모할 수 있을 것입니다.
질문인데요. 네, 한국은 사실 미국과 중국과 같이 여러 나라의 이해관계에 영향을 많이 받는 나라입니다. 네, 어떤 변수가 있든 독립적으로 생각할 것이 아니라 한국은 여러 가지를 고려해야 한다라고 생각하는데 어떻게 생각하시는지 궁금합니다.
네, 저희가 이런 글로벌 역학관계를 조망해 보게 되면 반드시 한 가지를 깨달아야만 합니다. 발표에서도 언급을 드렸는데요. 미중 간의 갈등이 강화되게 되면 어떻게 보면 한국이 승자로 우뚝 설 수 있습니다. 중국으로부터 시장 점유율을 가지고 올 수 있을 것이고요. 그리고 계속해서 기술 리더가 될 수 있을 겁니다. 이로 인해서 한국에게 긍정적인 요인이 될 수가 있습니다. 그리고 실제로 기회로 삼을 수가 있습니다. 한국이 더 많은 이점을 누리면서 실익을 거둘 수가 있습니다. 더불어서 그리고 제품의 퀄리티 그리고 브랜드 인지도에도 영향을 미칠 수가 있고요. 그리고 한국에서도 많은 ICT 성장을 견인할 만한 요소들, 전통적인 기술뿐만 아니라 신기술에 많은 동인이 발생할 수 있습니다.
함장님과 함께 만나봤습니다. Thank you for your inspiring speech. 네, 이렇게 앞으로도 한국의 미래
Thank you very
성장에
much. It is a great honor.
네, 한국 성장에 관심을 가져주시길 바라겠습니다. 고맙습니다.